I'm pleased to see you again. I was the intro speaker for this nice and distinguished audience 2 days ago. 2 days or the day? Oh, 2 days ago, yes. I hope you had a great time in Baku. This is a kind of nicely precedes after the presentation of Dr. Gasumli, because this is a study that we have done at this institution at Azerbaijan Diplomatic Academy in 2010-2011. About a year and a half, I personally and a lot of researchers have spent on trying to devise this idea. And this really looks into how Azerbaijan could be turned into a transportation logistic hub in Central Eurasia, as we call. So this is an interesting kind of blueprint. We have come up with a nice recommendations for the government of Azerbaijan. It also applies to other countries in the region, particularly Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, as well as other countries who are as kind of aspiring to become hubs in this particular part of the world. And we have published it as a book, which is not that expensive, and it's available at ADA bookstore on this campus. So I will start my presentation. This is the outline how I intend to proceed. So I will talk to you about a little bit about the Silk Road. But the first, let's pose the question. Basically, the first original question was about whether we can become a transportation hub. But as we dwell into this question, we understood that transportation by itself cannot be separated from non-oil economy as a whole. So as Dr. Gasumli, for example, highlighted quite nicely, the success of Azerbaijan in many ways contingent on the success of Azerbaijan in developing its non-oil economy. So if we kind of fail to develop our non-oil economy, we are not going to be smiling after 10 years. So the success is really to kind of turn this black oil into a human gold, but plus also non-oil value-added products that are going to contribute to our productivity. It's a big file, yes. It's, well, 11 megabytes, not that big. So I will be proceeding, but once they are there. In the old Silk Road, for example, some of you may be interested, and you will learn quite a lot, I hope, from this presentation as well. In the old Silk Road, if you know, there were quite a lot of caravansarais that I hope you visited some of them in Baku. But the historians report that old caravansarais used to travel about 35, 40 kilometers a day. So, and they were long caravans, about 2 kilometers each. So they would slowly move with camels and stop every 40 kilometers for rest, which meant that every 40 kilometers you had a motel of so-called, of today's world. Every 100, 150 kilometers you had a more sophisticated hotels of 2 stars, or 3 stars, available for trades as well. And every 500 to 1,000 kilometers, you had big mega cities. So the entire, this entire map was really covered by big mega cities and small motels that were connected and fed those mega cities. So Baghdad, Tabriz, at certain point Merv, a lot of cities in Iraq, in Central Asia, Bukhara, and as well. They were all, at certain point, mega cities that were linked very much into a big supply chain that worked quite efficiently, and maybe not under our current modern understanding, but effectively to the understanding of those times. And they were quite effective at the time. So today, this is the old transportation system which we had before, on the camels, etc. Today, the big ships really replace the entire supply chain movements. So now you can put one ship to the right, for example, could carry up to 15,000. And more recent data set, there is one that recently came up, can carry 18,000 containers at once. So it's very difficult to compete with such a cost-effective transportation means. And we, Azerbaijan and other countries, we are a landlocked country, and we are trying to attract some of the trade between Europe and Asia through us. That means we have to be quite competitive in order to be able to steal some of that trade that is very cheap and dominates the entire transport trade between Europe and Asia. About more than 90% of trade between Europe and Asia is really done through Suez Canal. That's the line that most of the trade really goes. So 90% of trade between Europe and Asia bypasses Azerbaijan and Central Asia and other countries as well. The major players, especially in Europe-Asia trade, are, for example, when it applies to us, are China, ASEAN countries. Russia, I put aside because Russia's trade with EU primarily dominated by hydrocarbons, oil. And some relevant is obviously India and South Korea. But when you look into EU and China trade, you see that there are probably 5 or 6 major countries that dominate that trade, which are out there, Germany being one of the major ones. Hence, it's very important to place ourselves into the context of these traders so that some of the trade that go between them could be analyzed and then see what we can really steal from this trade in a container through Azerbaijan. If you look at this, for example, table, you would see that EU 15 countries, the original EU countries, really dominate the trade between EU and China. More than 90% of trade, exports and imports, are between these 15 countries and China. So the rest of the countries, Romania, Bulgaria, etc., they play very little significance in this trade. Another important point, for example, when it comes to value of what is there traded, about a quarter of the value traded between China and EU is on air. So air transportation is quite expensive. And Baku is very much strategically located and can attract quite a lot of trade from Singapore, Malaysia, en route to, let's say, to Frankfurt. Because these big trains, big airplanes have to stop for refueling someplace, and Baku is very much strategically positioned for that. ASEAN countries are the ones that could be tapped for air transit. Another country in this scheme would be India, particularly with the north-south trade, which I'm going to touch on in a while. This will give you a perspective how much would it cost to transfer a 20-foot container from China to Frankfurt, for example. If you decide to go by air, it will cost you about 22,000 euros. If you decide to ship it on an ocean liner to Dubai and then airlift it, it would cost you half. Then you have an option of Trans-Siberian, for example, rail route, which would be about 6,000 euros nowadays. And the cheapest is really by ocean liner, but it will take you about 35 days to reach its destination. So the fastest is air, the longest is ship, but it's also the cheapest. When you look at this map, this is the railway connections between Eastern Europe, Europe and Asia, and you see that it's quite connected, right? So what's the problem? You can ship it. This is the road map. It's also connected. And this is the central corridor that involves Azerbaijan and other countries. But you see that at least 2 seas are there, Black Sea and Caspian Sea, which means that we, Azerbaijan and other countries who want to position ourselves as a hub, we have to develop this notion of intermodal transportation. So if you are shipping a container on a rail, at a certain point, it has to be moored on a ship and then cross the sea and then go on another train line, etc. And this has to be done very smoothly to attract the trade, and it has to be quite cheap to do so. Currently, for example, if you look at these calculations, this is a little outdated, but it will nonetheless give you a perspective. Trans-corridor, Traseka as we call, the corridor that passed through Azerbaijan and Georgia is quite expensive. So is Trans-Kazakhstan routes and as well as Trans-Siberian. But Trans-Siberian so far has been able to attract some trade primarily because of the Japanese and German involvement in that trade. If you look, this is a calculation for the north-south. From Helsinki, for example, to India, Mumbai, the cheapest and the fastest route actually involves Azerbaijan. But because there is a missing link between Iran and Azerbaijan, there is 100 kilometers of missing railroad that needs to be constructed. Because of that missing link, we still cannot operationalize this railroad. In Azerbaijan, there are 2 projects, ongoing projects. One is Kars-Halkalaki Railroad connection, which will be operational by the mid-2014, next year. The another project is what I mentioned from Gazvin to Rasht to Bandar Abbas to Astara down there. And part of it has already been constructed, but Rasht-Astara portion is missing. So once it's completed, you will have uninterrupted connections between Central Asia, Azerbaijan, and Europe, as well as Turkey. And on the other side, from northern countries or Scandinavian countries through Azerbaijan to Iran and India. Transport statistic I am going to pass, but just to mention it has increased transportation overall, has more than doubled in Azerbaijan. This trend is going to continue. Railway business, how it ought to be, for example, as I mentioned, the distance between Poti and Baku is 900 kilometers, but we cannot get a container from Poti to Baku in less than 2 days. This is a good example when you have 1,427 kilometers between UK and Italy, and you transfer it in less than 33 hours and in less than 1,000 euros. So this is kind of a good example of how it's ought to be. Another example for trucking, for example. Between Netherlands and Baku, the fastest route actually involves intermodal transportation. You board your truck in Rotterdam, you go to Rostock port in Germany. From Germany, you board a ship to Riga. The next morning, you are in Riga and drive all the way to Baku. It costs actually more or less the same as other routes, but it involves intermodal communication, which is a good example how it should be in the Caspian and the Black Sea as well. And air transportation, finally. Air transportation is, as I said, Baku is very much strategically positioned, and this is a fact. For example, Boeing 747-400F, this is a big freight train. If you travel from Frankfurt, let's say, to Shanghai, and you stop in Baku instead of Dubai, you would save 21 tons of fuel, which in roughly calculation, it's about $21,000. Not to mention its environmental impact if you do so. And you go down, for example, to Thailand. Those routes are even more efficient to use Baku as a stopover. And finally, the Caspian Sea traffic. I wouldn't spend too much because of the time limitation, but Caspian Sea ports have been dominated by oil shipments. We have to start thinking about what else we can move through this between Turkmenbashi and Akdağ and Baku. And if you remove really Iranian ports, about 65% of the train turnover in the Caspian is real oil-related products. And you probably have heard Baku, we had a nice port, but now because of the nice development of the Baku Boulevard, the current port is going to be moved 70 kilometers south, and it's going to be state-of-the-art port near Alat city. Turkmenistan is currently doing the same. They are also developing the airport, and eventually it will be kind of interconnected and complement each other. This port is going to be operational by 2015. So the idea is to really kind of create, as in all Silk Road, have a couple of mega cities or hub places which will be talking to each other and interconnected to each other. And the end of the strategy, there will be winners on all sides. So if you look at this map, you would understand that without Poti, Baku is meaningless. Without Turkmenbashi and Akdağ, Baku doesn't make too much sense. Same for those cities as well. So we are going to be wanting them to improve as they would want us to improve as well. And finally, going back to the original point, an example of, for example, grapes, as always I give. In London, you would get this grape. One is red and one is black, and they are very much fresh and nicely packed. But one comes from Chile and the other one is coming from South Africa. This shows you how efficient and effective this supply chain that it both arrives in London, packed, nicely washed and presented to you. If you want the same efficiency, you have to think bigger instead of your own national kind of strategy, because your national strategy no longer going to suit the bigger strategy that is out there. So if you are building roads, railroads, etc., you have to think about your neighbor, because if that neighbor does not possess as good roads as you do, then you are in trouble. So this strategy really goes beyond what general traditional strategies are out there. So our proposal really was about having two projects which is currently underway. One is the Eilat International Seaport, and the other one is the airport, and turn this kind of two projects into mega projects in non-oil sector. Assign them a free economic zone, as well as a production sharing agreement type of legal regime that exists in our energy sector. By doing this, you would attract foreign direct investment and the expertise and know-how in the non-oil sector, particularly in transport and logistics sector, which will open the door for further development in this sector.